Before we get started with tonight's episode, we have an unfortunate announcement to make. As some of you may already know, our friend and dearly beloved brother, Sam Levisee, has passed away. He was 100 years old. Sam was doing all right. He had turned 100. He got installed as Worshipful Master of River Oaks Lodge and even conferred an EA degree the day afterwards. However, on Friday, Sam was not feeling well, suffering from shortness of breath, and drove himself to the hospital. There, he was informed that his kidneys had failed, and he declined dialysis. Sam spent most of the weekend sleeping deeply, and when time came to pass at 1:30 on Monday, he passed away peacefully. I'm going to go ahead and read Sam's official obituary, and then Rhit will share the eulogy that he wrote for Brother Sam, which was read out loud during our stated meeting this past Monday. Sam E.J. Levisee, 100 years of age, passed away on Monday, July 10th, 2017. The funeral is at 1:30 p.m. on Friday in Greenwood Chapel. Interment will be in Greenwood Memorial Park. Sam was born on April 19th, 1917. He was past master and a life member of Fort Worth Masonic Lodge 148 AF and AM, and sitting master of River Oaks Masonic Lodge 1311. General Dynamics Management Club, and member of Southside Church of Christ. Sam was preceded in death by his wife of 75 years, Rose Levisee. He is survived by his son, Jerry Levisee, and his wife, Carmen, his grandchildren, Lance Levisee, Renee Hardig, and Kimberly Hodges, and great-grandchildren, Hunter Levisee, Harrison Hardig, Graham Hardig, Hillary Hardig, Lucas Levisee, and Samuel J. Levisee. If you'd like to attend Brother Sam's funeral, it will be on July 14th at 1:30 p.m. in the Greenwood Chapel. The Greenwood Chapel is part of Greenwood Funeral Homes and Cremation, and they are located at 3100 White Settlement Road in Fort Worth. We'd now like to share Rhit's eulogy for Brother Sam, followed by a silent 12 count. Thank you.
Sam E.J. Levisee, or as we called him, the Brick, was a Mason tried and true. He was the example we could all look to see the rewards of a righteous life. He showed us the value of dedicating oneself to the tenets of the craft. He was blessed with many good years because he had Freemasonry in his life, and he was a man who truly lived the teachings of the craft, and was duly rewarded for doing such. Let me share one example of how Sam's actions were drenched in Masonic lore. When I became a Master Mason, Brother Sam had made it clear to me that he was willing to help me learn the ritual work, and I did have the desire to do so, but it took me many months to work up the courage to ask him for the help. But he knew from the lessons of Masonry that he had to wait for me to ask. Then, when I was led to seek out his home, and I remember that day clearly, driving to his house with printed out directions from MapQuest, and when I parked in front of his house, I hesitated for 2 or 3 minutes thinking, what in the world was I doing here at this old man's house? But I decided to take a chance and knock. This small example of asking, seeking, and knocking may seem insignificant on paper, but those moments changed the path of my life so dramatically that it would be impossible to detail all the positive energy the simple act of asking, seeking, and knocking on Brother Sam's door has afforded me. Brother Sam told me long ago as a young Mason that the memory work was the best education he had ever received, and while this put a spark in me that led me down a path to obtain my A certificate, I had no idea at the time of the scope of the education he was referring to. The Brick had the knack for seeing things in people they did not see themselves and inspiring them to act. For a kid who thought memorizing the preamble for the Declaration of Independence in school was a near impossible task, Sam has shown me depths of myself I fear I would have never discovered had it not been for his inspiration. Brother Sam was not afraid to counsel any brother on any irregularity, but more especially our memory work. I am sure all of us who worked with him can hear his booming voice saying, "That's I am, not I'ma," or "There ain't no contractions in Masonry." When he walked in lodge, you would see everyone's demeanor take it up a notch. And while we all got nervous as we could be, It was not out of fear or of upsetting him. It was out of the desire to show him our best, and he made many, if not all of us, better men in the process. Yet as tough and as knowledgeable as he was also just as eager to learn and take correction himself. The brick knew one of the secrets to a happy life was work, and he planned his day accordingly, to which led him to a long and happy life with his family, in his profession, and in his Masonic career. One day we were supposed to be floor schooling, but were milling around and had not got started, and he gently asked me, "What are we doing tonight?" I replied, "Floor school." He then said in the same tone, "Well, let's get to it. I'm 94 and don't have time to waste." Needless to say, floor school was promptly started. Brother Sam knew the value of endeavored labor and did his best to impart that wisdom onto his brothers. The brick turned 100 years old this year, and from how active he was, you would have never guessed he was at that age. Just last week he was telling me how at 92 he was on his roof trimming trees. He knew that to slow down would only allow the reaper to catch up. This year marked his 50th year as a Mason, and for 20 of those years he was an officer of the lodge. He was just installed as Master of River Oaks Lodge and conferred an EA degree the very next night. He also received the Golden Trowel Award in 1992, but the awards and accolades, while he enjoyed them, was not his crowning achievement. We of 148 are his crowning achievement. Many of us who sit here tonight, and many others living and gone who he helped make better men, was what he was most proud of. I want to leave you with this last example of how Brother Sam, the brick, wove the teachings of Freemasonry into his life. As Masons, we are taught to live a robust life of love with humility and a giving heart, and each one of us who knew Sam, even briefly, knew he had these qualities. And if the Mason heeds this wisdom, when at last his time comes, he can receive the grim tyrant death as a kind messenger. And it takes little contemplation to know this would not be an easy task. But Sam has shown us through his last actions that it can be done. Last week he was feeling ill and decided he needed to see his doctor. And being Sam, he drove himself there, where he shortly found out his kidneys were failing and that he needed to be placed on dialysis. And Brother Sam, knowing that refusing the dialysis meant death, he told the doctor and his family he was ready to go on his next journey. And through his valiant life and actions, he was indeed able to welcome the grim tyrant death as a kind messenger. We love you, Brother Sam.
Welcome to Fort Worth 148's podcast, where we meet to discuss Masonic topics and strive to build value in the brotherhood. The opinions and statements of the participants do not represent any positions or stance of any Grand Lodge or Lodge and are solely the viewpoints of the participants.
Welcome back to the podcast, brothers. This is Rhit Moore, past master and current secretary at Fort Worth 148.
Grant Gates, current junior warden with 148.
Gabriel Jagush, Master Mason with Fort Worth 148. And we have a special guest tonight.
Robert Marshall, past master at Waco 92, and current secretary.
Brother in arms right there. This is your first year, right?
That's right, it is.
Well, it takes a little while to get used to, but it's not much to it once you get your rhythm.
And,
we'll see how it goes.
I guess once the weeping is done.
Exactly.
I don't think secretary would be one I could take on. I don't know. It seems like a lot, Rhett.
I'm with you, Grant. Most of the time, I can barely keep my own life together. So if I had to run a lodge behind the scenes like the secretaries do, I'd be toast. And so with the lodge, I would much rather do as a past master. I would much rather do something like chaplain or like Tyler, just be outside.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I like the
No
tradition
doubt.
that some lodges have of making the JPM the Tyler. That kind of actually makes sense. Be like, all right, man, like you're done with your year. Like you are not interfering with this one.
That is an old Masonic tradition. I've seen that going back to the 1700s.
That's cool.
Hmm.
The other one that I've seen on kind of the opposite end is making the senior past master the Tyler, because theoretically he should know everybody in the lodge.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Nowadays, I think it makes more sense to have the JPM be that, because usually the guys that they were the past master ages ago. Usually they've moved on to like appendant bodies and stuff like that, and leadership positions in those, and so that's where their time goes. So.
I think it's in a Mackey encyclopedia where they suggested that old custom was at least partially with the idea in mind that it would force the outgoing worshipful master to kind of return back to the ranks and relinquish control over the lodge so that it could actually be turned over.
Right, I think it's a very healthy sort of choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, because as far as guidance goes, that's what your chaplain is for,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I have one quick question that I'm going to answer really quick, and then I have a discussion question for all of us to go in. I was told that if you have tattoos, you're not going to get voted on in a lodge. Is this true or not? And the answer is, you're going to be fine. I am covered in tattoos. Obviously, our podcast listeners have not seen that because we are in audio format, but I'm heavily tattooed. I got voted in. We've got a lodge brother who has tattoos literally going up to his neck. Or actually up to his chin. They're on his neck, and he's got his hands tattooed. You're going to be fine. Anyway, the discussion question for today is, does your lodge or lodge building or appendant body building, whatever it may be, have any resident ghosts? I know that ours kind of does. Robert, do you have any good ghost stories from your buildings?
About 8 years ago, when I was junior steward, I had come in, was supposed to be meeting the senior steward, prepping a meal before the meeting, all that. And I came in, nobody was there, got started. I went back to the back of the building. And while I was back there, I heard the door open and shut and assumed it was the senior steward showing up for us to start the meal. I hollered to him from the back of the building, told him, I was back here and I'll be out in a little bit. And I can't remember now, it's been 8 years, what he said back. He said something. And then about 5 minutes later, I came out and said, "Troy." And I didn't hear anything back. And I looked around, I didn't see him. And I looked out our windows, and there was Troy pulling into the parking lot. So there was absolutely nobody there. And I was 18 or 19 at the time and figured, you know what? I'm never going to say anything about this because they already don't take me seriously. So I just kept my mouth shut. And then about 1 year later, we were sitting in the lobby all having our dinner. And from the next table over, I heard a past master talking about having walked across the lodge room one night in the dark, and he felt a hand come up and grab him on the shoulder, kind of like what happens during a degree. And so I immediately, all right, I've got a story. And then it was like a round robin all the way to the table. Everybody had different stories. So we actually had a ghost hunter team come out to the lodge, and I'll have to send you guys that audio. They recorded the sounds of some gavels, some voices, and a typewriter. They were able to get the sound of a typewriter, which, of course, there was a time when they used a typewriter for the minutes. I'm kind of off and on it. Ghosts aren't my thing. I'm a historian. I like dealing with facts. So do ghosts exist and all that? I don't know. But those are the stories we have. And I can tell you for sure, Ed Brown, past master at 92 and a well-known guy on esoteric work, 100% believes there are ghosts at our lodge.
Wow, that's really cool. I can't even begin to explain the ridiculousness of the thrilled, silent screaming that I just engaged in, because I was like, "Oh man, that is so cool!" So
when I heard ghost hunters, man, I was on board.
So on board. I need to hear this audio sometime. That sounds amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. So
there's a couple at the temple that swear there's spirits moving about in there.
Yep. A couple guys that say that a couple guys they say I'd believe it, and then there's some guys that say I've seen it. So yeah, we've got what is there, 3 of them or like 4, something like that.
You got me.
I had no idea. I never even heard someone say that there were ghosts in our building until tonight.
There's one that hangs out on the 4th floor supposedly. And I think there's one that hangs out in the ballroom. I can't remember what it was, but I was listening to one brother talk, and he was talking about how he got into the elevator on the 4th floor, and he hit the button for the basement, and as the door was closing, like a face looked in. And then, like, it was dark. He was the last one on the floor, but like a face looked in really quick, and so then the door closed, and he opened the door button, and then when he opened the door button, nobody was there.
That's not okay.
Yeah. And so I would be pretty freaked out. I think it was Kurt.
That elevator would have became a bathroom for me.
Yeah. So
now, here's my thing, though, and I've heard I've lodges in 50 states and 6 countries, and I've heard ghost stories everywhere. But here is always my take on it. If there are ghosts in your Masonic temple, who do you think it is? It's going to be a brother. And I mean, are you really under any threat by the matter? I can't imagine that you would be.
You might get corrected on your ritual work, but that's it.
Exactly. You just think the living past masters are grouchy. Wait till you hear those ghosts.
Yeah.
That's not how we did it in my year. In 1876.
That's greatness.
Rock and roll. Well, let's get on to the actual episode content. So today's title is ambitiously Lone Star Masonry. And our special guest tonight is Robert Marshall from Waco 92, as y'all already know from his introduction. So, Robert, can you tell us about yourself in a nutshell?
Yeah, and we want to know pre-Masonry, Robert, where you grew up, kind of thing, that kind of stuff. You know, what kind of led you into interests that you have today?
Sure. My first memory of Masonry was when I was a kid. My great-grandfather, who was a World War II vet, he had some Masonic stuff here and there and told me some stories. But when I was fairly young, my oldest brother was in a football scrimmage. He was about 13, and he was hit by an opponent, tackled, and he was writhing around on the ground in pain. Coach made him get up, walk it off. Ultimately, the next day he couldn't really walk very well, so my dad took him to the hospital. And at the time, we weren't exactly wealthy, to put it lightly. And they told him, my dad, that he would never walk again. He had broken off a piece of his hip, and it was floating around, and he just wasn't going to be able to walk, which is devastating for a 13-year-old athlete. My great-grandfather, being a 40-something-year Shriner and Scottish Rite member, suggested that my dad take him to the Scottish Rite Hospital. After seeing 3 separate doctors had told him he'd never walk again, but the Scottish Rite Hospital fixed him right up. And today he's a very able-bodied construction worker, and it's all because of what the Scottish Rite Hospital did for him up there in Dallas. So at a young age, that's kind of how I was really affected by it, and I greatly admired my great-grandfather. Those were the 2 things that made me seek it out when I turned 18.
Yeah. What town did you grow up in, Robert?
It's called Robinson. It's a small town on the south side of Waco.
So you've been in the Waco area your whole life. Are you a member of any other lodges in the Waco area?
I am not. I was born in Dallas, Parkland Hospital up there. That's where my dad's family's from. But we moved to Waco almost immediately after I was born. And you're right, I spent my whole life here.
Gotcha. And so you said you joined when you were 18?
I did, that's right.
And so you joined Waco 92, I'm assuming.
That's right. The youngest person who ever joined there.
Well, was there any particular reason, or was it the only?
My great-grandfather's lodge, he had died years earlier, but his lodge was meeting in the same building. And I just didn't have much success getting in touch with his lodge members. but I did have success contacting members of Waco 92. At the time, I was a Baylor student, and the senior warden or worshipful master at the time was Tom Whedon, and he worked at Baylor. So when I sent an email to the Waco 92 website asking about Masonry, I was directed to him since I was on Baylor campus where his office was, and went and met those guys, and that's kind of how I wound up at Waco 92.
Nice.
That's kind of going into our social media. You know, you gotta be good on social media, guys, whether it's emails or anything else. But
Yeah,
absolutely.
So kind of tying into you being so young when you went through the degrees, which, let's be real, like joining at the age of 18 is really young. What did you like? Can you tell us a little bit about being one of the youngest guy in Waco 92?
Especially that catechism process of coming through as a candidate, the experience being a young person is going to be different. For one thing, almost all the guys were quick to tell me, look, you're going through school, your brain's used to memorizing things right now. Get this work done as fast as you can and get through it. Now, I did that, and I was entered past raised, and I think it was less than 3 months. But I don't say that in a boastful way. I actually regret it, and it's through no fault of the guys who suggested it, but I learned the work as fast as I could, and I didn't really take time to digest it. So I think a lot of young guys, when they come in, they're kind of aggressively pushed to learn the work as fast as they can. I've seen it at other lodges, and so I'm always quick to tell young guys, slow down. If anything, you've got lots of time, so take your time and really absorb what you're learning and what you're going through. However, I was very well received. Average age in Masonry when I joined in Texas, I think, was 73, and it's lowered a little bit now. But you see an 18-year-old or 19-year-old guy walking around, and you're used to seeing 70-year-olds, you're going to get somewhat excited. So that was nice. And the other thing is, most of my friends at the time were joining college fraternities, SIGEP and stuff like that. And I was getting pulled pretty hard to join those, and I was still hanging out with those guys, but I wasn't impressed with what I found there. I felt like if I was going to join a fraternity, I wanted to join a fraternity where I felt like I was a part of something bigger than me and something that was going to lead to something more positive than late night partying and other antics like that. So I really took a different path from most of my friends. They joined college frats and I went with Freemasonry, and I'm really glad I did.
Tell us a little bit about your lodge. I know it's likely the oldest lodge in Waco, having the number 92. Give us a little bit of the history and
Sure.
Maybe tell us something unique.
Waco Lodge is the oldest lodge in McLennan County. So far, my count is up to 26 of the lodges that have branched off from us over the years. It was founded in 1851, and I do say founded. There was something weird that happened with our charter. It was granted by the Grand Lodge in August of 1851, but for some reason we did not get it and continued operating under dispensation until January 23rd, 1852. But we were originally named Bosque 92 because there was nothing but a forest where Waco is now. And about 4 years into our existence, actually, I'll back up. 6 months into our existence, we founded a small college in Waco that will be interesting to you guys. It eventually became TCU and much later moved to Fort Worth. So Texas Christian University, its very earliest beginnings was called Waco Masonic Institute and was owned by Waco 92 until we sold it to another school that became Ayn Rand and then became TCU. So right there from the get-go, we were getting in the community in pretty big ways, especially for the 1850s. And 4 or 5 years into our existence, we added Joseph Spate to our ranks, who at least Masonically speaking, is the most impressive member in our history. When he moved to Texas in 1855, he was 26 years old and the sitting Grand Master of Mississippi. So needless to say, he was immediately made the Worshipful Master in 92. He ultimately served as Master of the Lodge 16 different times. And the next closest in our lodge history, I think, is 4. So it was really unusual for that to happen. But alongside, he also later brought Baylor to Waco. And alongside him, early Texan legends like Sol Ross and his father, Shapley Ross, and George E. Rath. I heard an Aggie whoop out there. That's too bad. I didn't realize I was going to be in that kind of company here. But
my apologies. I'm dirtying it up here, aren't I?
I'm just kidding. George E. Rath, the father of Waco, his statue stands outside the Texas Ranger Museum. He was a charter member of Waco Lodge. And in many ways, in the 1800s, not just Waco, but the greater Central Texas area, if you were anybody, you were either a member or somehow linked to Waco 92. It just kind of grew that way.
You said that his statue's outside of the Texas Ranger Museum. Is it true that at one time you had to be a Mason in order to be a Texas Ranger? I've heard that before. I'm not sure if it's true, but I figured you'd be the one to ask.
I would have to say it's not true just because I know of a couple of early Texas Rangers who weren't Masons, but I do know that a very high percentage of them were. So at the very least, it must have been helpful.
You know, the part I like about that story is you talked about the past master serving 16 times. It's kind of a testament to how they elected on merit, and there wasn't this progressive line of who's next. You know, they wanted the best man for the job.
Absolutely, and that was Joseph Spate. He helped form the esoteric work for the whole jurisdiction of Texas whenever he moved here. There was a handful of guys put on that committee who really formalized how we do our degrees and all that. He was one of those. So one of the reasons, if you ever visit Mississippi and see degree work or just lodge work, you'll notice it's very similar to Texas work, more so than the other states that are closest to us. And that's because Joseph Spate came from there.
So as a historian, you have to be like a kid in a candy store at Waco 92.
Oh, gosh, man. I've been doing it for 8 years, digging through our archives. I've found just ridiculous things. A signed letter from J. Edgar Hoover. A signed letter from Cecil B. DeMille, the director. Just last week, I was able to confirm a document that our senior warden actually found helping me digging through records last year. And I haven't really shared anything about this document, but it's interesting to all of Texas Masonry. Of course, the story is that Anson Jones in 1835 successfully acquired dispensation from Louisiana to open what would eventually be Holland Lodge. And it wasn't just him, it was a group of guys, but the most famous part of that story is that he actually rode through the Battle of San Jacinto with the dispensation in his saddlebags. Well, which is a really fun story, but if you back up just before San Jacinto, in December of 1835, word had traveled around the Texans that Anson had received that dispensation or charter. And I know that word was traveling because what we found in our minutes is a little letter written by Anson Jones that is his handwriting. It's dated December 1835. It's the original document. I don't know how in the world we got it, but we did. And it's a letter from the other brothers to him. This version is one that he copied down for his own records. And they're basically saying, look, we heard you got dispensation. Can you open a lodge ASAP? Because we want to have masonry in Texas. And that's the gist of the letter. And it's not just anybody. These guys are the head surgeon for the Republic of Texas, The guy saved Santa Anna's life. Santa Anna tried to commit suicide while he was a prisoner of the Texans, and this guy was the doctor that saved him. And so that's the kind of names that are on this letter. And the thing's just floating around in our archives. We don't even know it's there.
Oh, my goodness.
Found some hand-painted pottery from the 1790s that was made in New England on the East Coast when George Washington was still master of his lodge. Just stuff like this is all over our archives, and we had no idea it was there. So you're right. I'm a kid in a candy store. The things I'm finding are ridiculous, and I'm loving it.
That's awesome.
That's incredible.
That's fate.
Going through that and never get through it all. Holy cow.
That's absolutely true. A major Texas historian who was a member of our lodge, his name's Roger Conger, and he did a history of our lodge book on our centennial in 1950. And so I've used a lot of his stuff to get started, but I've been filling in a lot of blanks. Even he wasn't able to do it because he didn't have the internet and other resources in 1950. But started with his work, and it just never ends. It never ends.
Well, that's good stuff, no doubt. So what day does your lodge meet for stated meeting?
We meet every second Thursday, dinner at 6, meeting at 7.
And are you guys on the north side of Waco?
Yeah, kind of. It's more west. We're near the lake. Also, we are on what used to be a World War I Air Force base. And it's right next to the HOT Fairgrounds. So if you've ever been to the rodeo in Waco, you were right next to us.
No, I've been there before. It was years ago, 7 years ago or so, for secretary school.
Oh, okay.
But I couldn't remember if it was on the north or south, because for me, it's closer than some Dallas lodges for sure. Less traffic.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Now, our original meeting place was downtown Square, and in the 1870s, 1880s, I found in our minutes this really funny story about how some of our lodge members used to stand on the third story of our building and look out the window across the suspension bridge, which our members built and owned and charged a toll for the public to use. But they would watch the bridge and see who was moving into town coming, because that was the only way to get into town was to come across the bridge back then. And they would kind of judge based on how those people looked. Do we want that guy to be a member of the lodge? No, not really.
That's greatness.
Yeah.
When did you guys move to the building you're in now?
We moved there in 1969. It was part of, it happened all across the country, the 1960s, urban renewal and all that, when businesses and organizations were leaving downtown areas and going to the suburbs. So that was what we did. We left our building, which is still on 8th and Washington now, mostly abandoned, and moved out to where we are now on Cobb's Drive.
Gotcha. It's a beautiful building. It's awesome. Huge.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. We're actually considering moving somewhere back downtown now, looking at options. But we haven't made any hard decisions on it yet.
No doubt. What about offices? I know you're past master, secretary. Any other offices? You mentioned junior steward. Did you work up through every?
We're pretty serious about the lineup at 92, and I know not all lodges are. That's perfectly okay, but I did have to sit in every chair on the way to the east.
Cool.
So junior steward, junior deacon, junior warden, senior warden. And I'm glad I did. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
My favorite chair is senior deacon.
Oh, yes. I get to pro-tem that one a lot, and I just thoroughly enjoy that, both for business purposes and for ritual.
Oh, yeah. It's kind of the heartbeat of the lodge, if you're not counting, I guess, a secretary.
Well, and I think that is one of the best. It's like your first training position to really have a speaking role in front of lodge. Because when we had the meeting the other night, I think Gabe had 19 or 20 visitors. Most of them had some kind of title, Grand Lodge style, so you got to know protocol, order, all that stuff. And then,
yeah. And I only messed up the order once. But I got all the visitors and all the past masters, so I was actually pretty proud of myself.
You messed up once, but you were told about it 7 times.
Actually, nobody mentioned it afterwards, for which I'm very grateful.
Must have been pretty bad then.
But yeah, no, I was trying to. Oh wow, yeah, yeah. I was like, I had to, So I asked the deputy grandmaster of Oklahoma was visiting, and so I said, Right Worshipful, you are Right Worshipful, right? And he says, yes, in Oklahoma we're Right Worshipful. And I said, how do you want me to introduce you? Corky would be fine. So I introduced him as Right Worshipful Corky Grigsby, Deputy Grandmaster of Oklahoma. And it's just amazing because I'm just like, next year their Grandmaster is going to be Most Worshipful Corky, and I love that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's a good question to ask, though. Some jurisdictions, they go by some are Right Worshipful. They've got all kinds of different titles depending on where you are.
Yeah, the one difference that I ran into was, and you know what, I think, no, I got it right. Their DDGMs are worshipfuls instead of right worshipfuls. And so I did get that right, but I had to think about it when I was saying it because I actually wrote it down on the card just to double check.
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite aspect of Masonry and why?
Well, in college, one of my majors was great text and the other was history. History's kind of self-explanatory, and that ought to tell you why I love that part of Masonry. But great text was a peculiar little program at Baylor's Honors College for super nerds, and it was a hybrid of philosophy, theology, and literature. So if you can imagine somebody who would think it was a good idea to spend 4 years doing that, why I would find value in Masonry. All of those things are tied up in Masonry. And the really neat thing for me is the way that we take philosophy, theology, literature from all over the place. If you're reading through Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, or Albert Mackey, any of that stuff, they are making allusions to the greatest writing, the greatest religions, everything in human history. And so they make references to it. And then Masonry has a unique way of taking those things and teaching you ways to use it in a very real way in the modern day. That's my favorite thing about Masonry.
That is really cool.
Nice, yeah.
And there's years and years and years of literature. I mean, you could start, I think you could conceivably start reading now and until your death, not stop reading. Like if you said, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read continuously for 24/7, you would never run out of stuff to read in the craft.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt. Something while you were talking, I had a thought. And, being 18 and joining a fraternity that at that time especially was full of old guys, how did you fit into where you felt comfortable going back every time?
That's a good question. Now, for me, I've always kind of gotten along with older people better. I had older brothers that I ran around with as a kid. I was very, very close to both of my great-grandparents. So older folks have always just kind of been easier for me to get along with. However, for the other way around, the older brothers getting used to having me around, I think they're still trying to figure that out.
That may be a better way to frame the question because, I didn't necessarily, I respected my elders. I didn't have an issue being around them. It was connecting with them is where I found my issue. And I had my cousin there, luckily, to where we were the same age and we'd snicker about stuff. But when it came to sitting at the dinner table with a bunch of the old guys, I had a hard time finding common ground to have like that just off the cusp discussion.
I agree. You know what, though? I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's part of what organizations like Freemasonry are centered around. It puts us on a level and forces us to learn how to communicate and get along across those kinds of divides. So whether it's generational or financial or whatever it may be, I think that's part of why we do this. It's that Freemasonry is necessarily going to make it easy, but it puts us in an environment where we have to learn to communicate with people who are different than us, even though we're talk about being a like-minded group of men. Our past master Ed Brown has said the best way to get 50 people together who won't agree on anything is to make it Masons. So, I think there's some truth to that, and we tend to want to think that that's a bad thing, but I don't think it necessarily is.
I think you're actually hitting the nail on the head. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I love this fraternity, because, here I am, I graduated college half a decade ago, and I'll be sitting down to eat, have coffee and cookies with, and the guy sitting next to me literally punched a Nazi in the face in Europe, and we can still bond over something mutually,
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. And what a great way to prep the brother that's come. I mean, because if you're going to become a better man, that's going to happen mostly through trials and tribulations, uncomfortable moments, whether it is sitting at the dinner table and finding conversation or giving a speech. So that's a great way to look at it.
And it gives us a way to, carry that knowledge on. Some of those guys, you sit down with them and you'll get a lesson on a topic that you never even thought about before. And all of a sudden you're chasing down a rabbit hole. So you carry knowledge on. These days you get on the internet and you research and you go forward. Well, a lot of those guys aren't out there blogging what they know, so we're preserving a lot of knowledge that way.
And so to kind of jump topics, since you have kind of more of the context of the long history of Masonry in the Lone Star State, I kind of wanted to ask, what do you think the strengths and weaknesses are of Masonry in Texas? I guess present day and with historical context, or, doesn't even need that, but strengths and weaknesses, I guess. Is there something that, because you've been to lodges in 50 states and 6 countries, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so I guess maybe you have a little bit more traveling context that some of us, hint me, don't have.
I think, for one thing, we've got a major strength that we often don't take advantage of, and that's that Freemasons established the society we're living in. And I don't mean just the United States, but Texas itself. All those guys were Masons. And I think that especially with the historic law 48, if you've got even a moderately historic lodge dating back to the 1800s or even into the early 1900s, and you look through those membership rolls, you're going to see names that are extremely relevant to Texans. And in Texas, we are famous all across the country, not just Masonically, but everywhere, because we have so much pride in being Texan and what Texas history is all about. I think we, as Texas Masons, could really tap into that more to build relevancy and positive relationships with our communities, be it museums or schools or what have you. People care about who our members have been. We just have to let them know that those guys were Masons in the first place.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that really surprises people. My girlfriend works in the medical industry. She's a nurse, and she was really surprised to hear that John Peter Smith and Cook and all these other guys were Masons. And then John Peter Smith was a charter member of my lodge, so it's kind of cool.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of start sharing with our communities, because that'll get people interested in what Masonry is. Why were those guys whose names are on our street signs or schools or hospitals, why were those guys willing to invest time and money in this thing? And then we have started a conversation that can go all kinds of directions. Weaknesses, you asked about weaknesses.
Yes.
I think a couple of major weaknesses. I'll pick two, and this one really started to stand out to me as I traveled, and that's our slow evolution into a a positive relationship with African American Masons. In other jurisdictions I've been to where that relationship is already well established, those guys are benefiting in big ways for having established those relationships. But we're getting there, and that should be pointed out. We live in the Deep South. It was going to take time, and that's happening. So that's a very good thing. The other weakness that I think is still very much a problem that needs to be addressed is there is an extreme amount of distrust going both ways between our Blue Lodges and the Grand Lodge, and the Grand Lodge and the Blue Lodges. And I don't think any particular individual or entity is at fault. I think it's just something that's kind of developed over time. And for a lot of reasons, we have struggled to get things accomplished because of that distrust, whether it be fixing up the Grand Lodge building or the Grand Lodge doing things for the Blue Lodges around the state. We haven't maintained the strong relationship between the two that you place. A lot of you see it all over the state.
That's actually something that I'd noticed. I went to Grand Lodge the first time this year in January, and had some interesting conversations with a lot of people that have been around Grand Lodge a lot longer than I have, and hearing conversations around individual lodges, that kind of thing. There really is, like you say, there's some sort of weird, deep animosity between guys at the lodge level and then guys at the Grand Lodge level. And this includes guys in the Grand Line. Like I've heard guys in the Grand Line like, well, people don't understand this. And I'm like, whoa, okay. Obviously a lot more intensely than I translated. But
there is an obvious disconnect between the two. And how we got there, that's a good question. And how we get out is another even better one. But it is there, and I think we have to draw attention to it because, you always hear people say, well, Grand Lodge is a body of lodges and past masters, which is totally true. Mm-hmm. We vote those men in, and we vote the laws that they enforce throughout the year. Mm-hmm. And maybe we've gotten that law book a little too thick, for our own good. Mm-hmm. We got to man up and deal with our own issues.
Honestly,
I think some of it might come. Oh,
go for it.
All right. I was going to say, I think some of it may come back to Texas history. Generally, Texans have a distrust of any sort of centralized power, right? You meet a lot of Texans. Go back to the reason we became our own country. We distrusted a centralized power in Mexico, and that's just, it's kind of ingrained into people that have grown up here.
Yeah. There's no doubt. I've seen, we can look back on history and see when lodges and Grand Lodges were clicking on all cylinders and they built the buildings they built and things like that. So we know it's possible. It's just getting back to that point, because if you sit down with any one of them, in their heart of hearts, anybody in a lodge, they want what's best for Masonry. Mm-hmm. It's just we haven't all gotten on the same page. Mm-hmm. And when we do, we'll be unto the, hopefully it'll be changed drastically. Mm-hmm.
And I think as something you mentioned, Rhit, our law book has gotten kind of thick, and I'd love to go. It'd be really nice to go back and just start with a big ol' black marker, just start slashing stuff out until we've got just the bare framework, and then just add things as absolutely only slightly necessary. It'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, and it would take some diligent research, but there are some things that we can remove out of that law book that have been used in the wrong manner, that ultimately you're obligated to act a certain way or do a certain thing, and we should be held accountable to our obligations. And that's where we've gotten ourselves in trouble, because we have a problem in lodge. Who do we go to? We go to Grand Lodge. Deal with this, and it should be dealt with in our own lodge.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that goes down to that individualistic nature, But one of these days we'll cure that, right? No.
We're getting there. We're getting there. I think. Do what, Gabe?
Oh no.
Well, I was going to go to see what keeps Robert motivated.
Yeah.
What keeps me motivated?
Yeah, what keeps you pulling the door open and walking into lodge routinely?
Friendships. I've got some very, very, very good friendships that I've developed through Masonry, and continuing those friendships gives me reason to think that I can make more or develop them stronger. Chances to get involved with charitable things in a way that I think makes a greater impact than I could do on my own. The history. I can't tell you how much fire it gives me every time I find something new in our records. Just a couple weeks ago, I was actually down here at the lake in Marble Falls, and I was sitting out on the patio going through our membership list. Now, understand, over the last 8 years, I've looked through this membership list probably 1,000 times. And as I'm looking through it, I see the name Ted Lyons. And I think, surely it's not Ted Lyons, the baseball pitcher. And so I pull up in our membership and get the date. And on his membership card, his original membership card in our records, his profession actually says ball player. And Ted Lyons is, he's one of the greatest baseball pitchers of all time. And there's no argument to be made about it. He very clearly, looking at his numbers and his career, was one of the best of all time. I didn't know this guy was a member of our lodge, digging through our membership. So when I come across something like that, it gives me a motivation, not just to keep doing history research, but it gives me a little bit more pride in walking into those doors at the lodge and knowing that there is a history there in that building and in those membership roles that needs to be shared with the community. And as a historian, that's a big thing I have a passion for, is making people aware of their own histories and why it matters. Masonry has history locked away in closets all over the country. Lodges have records and photos and artifacts locked away in their vaults, and they don't know they're there. And if that stuff was all just suddenly curated and shared in a public way, I'm pretty convinced that Masonry would make a pretty big turnaround.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty cool.
People care about that
looking
stuff.
back to move forwards, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've used that in Waco. Still experimenting with how to do it, but I've used it to reach out to the local museums. We've got the Texas Ranger Museum in Waco. We've got the Dr. Pepper Museum, all these things that are to. And by reaching out to those museums, we're building different relationships throughout the community, not just with those museums themselves, but also just the general public who now come in and see a Masonic symbol next to somebody's name or on their statue or what have you. And it's giving them a reason to that Masons aren't people who try to take over the world. Masons are people who have been involved in local communities since those communities were being born. They're the names on your street signs. They're not the names that are secretly trying to take over the world.
Yeah.
Robert, is there anything, as you're going through your research, you found that we really have to be implementing today? Something we need to look at and say, this has to start again right now, that maybe we're missing in what we're doing?
I think everywhere I look through our history, the process of becoming a Mason was more difficult. It took time. Now, they might actually go through the degrees fairly quickly, but especially when it comes to becoming an officer or taking on larger roles in the lodge, you are expected to prove yourself one way or another. And you were mentioning earlier in this about how we really did things based on merit. We were more careful in that way back then, whereas now I've seen in different places all over that maybe sometimes just because of a vacuum and that there was nobody else to step in, guys who are less meritorious, we'll say, end up in positions of power in the fraternity and when they shouldn't be. And that's not something that was really happening 100. The other thing is very clear public community involvement. When we had St. John's celebration in June and December, and it was a public event in the downtown area, and hundreds or thousands of people showed up from all over the city, people who were interested in being Masons and people who weren't, who just wanted to be a part of the celebration. When we had funeral processions that were walking from the lodge to the cemetery with the body, we were doing things in a very visible way. And somewhere about the 1950s or 60s, all over the country, we shut our doors. We stopped being public. We started acting like things were secret that were never supposed to be secret in the first place. And as a result, you had a very major shift in Masonic history, whereas up to the 1950s or 60s, since the beginning, conspiracy theories had all. However, because we had very public presence in our local communities, the general public had something else to look to identify what Masons were instead of just the conspiracy theories. When we shut our doors and stopped being public, the only thing left for people to learn about Masonry was the conspiracy theories. So now you have just this general belief that the Dan Brown National Treasure idea of Masons taking over the world is the real thing, and they have no reason to think otherwise. So I think the best answer I could give you to your question is we have to be more public again.
I love that you're pointing out that we used to be very public, because there's a large movement of guys that say, yeah, we need to be more secret again. And, well, that wasn't exactly the case. Maybe ritualistically we were more secret, but we weren't more private necessarily.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Our rituals were kept behind closed doors, but we were very public in our presence and our charity and just when we did things.
So true. I mean, you even go back to the earlier days. The first school building was our lodge room.
Yeah, that's something in Texas. And it happened in other places, but in Texas, school was a lodge.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just some great insight, 'cause I think that those are things we've discussed before. But being able to put a historical context about, like you said, making it a little harder to get there and be a Mason, and trying to be a little more public. We're not the Illuminati, and some guys I've seen try to use that as a selling point. We're a secret society.
Oh,
You can't know until you're a master Mason. Know the secrets of Masonry. It's like, man, that's kind of a hard sell. Or the George Washington sell. You'll get one of two of those.
What's the George Washington sell?
The George Washington was a Mason, so you need to be a Mason too. I mean,
I feel like that's one of the worst. I feel like that's one of the worst statements ever too, because George Washington, by his own admission, was not very good at being a Mason. So, and I'm not denigrating Brother George. That's what he said. So
I'll have to admit a bias here. For me personally, telling me George Washington was a Mason, and that would have worked on me, because being a history nerd, I got to tell you, the cologne I wear is the exact same cologne from the exact same company that George Washington got his cologne.
Wow,
so
cool.
I mean, I'm a real nerd for that stuff, but I do also agree with you. Saying George Washington was a Mason, and that's outdated, and so is I hate to say it, but John Wayne. I love John Wayne movies. I grew up on them. But most people at my age, I'm 27, most people my age didn't.
Yeah, I'd say most guys our age don't care at all. Actually, I know some guys my age that, I grew up watching John Wayne movies with my dad, and there are guys that I talk to and be like, wait, you don't know who John Wayne is? And then I realize, wait, we're in the minority. And so...
You guys ever drop a Clint Eastwood line and then look around the room and it's crazy?
See, that's bad, though, because I feel like Clint Eastwood is way more recent, so the fact that people aren't picking up on that is kind of alarming.
Oh, this early Eastwood stuff that's really good, man.
This actually brings up something that if we can backtrack, that I've noticed in our old records, that when people were coming to be Masons, they were showing up at the lodge and turning in a petition. Our secretary used to keep a card in every man's file that said exactly why that person said he wanted to be a Mason whenever he showed up. Well, you can use that as a reference. It's something I've started to do when new guys show up and they tell us why they want to be a Mason. In the future, when you're dealing with that person in any way at the lodge, you can use that reference to understand what motivates him in Masonry. And it's not John Wayne was a Mason. It's, maybe the Scottish Rite Hospital helped him in some way, or his mentor in the emergency medical services was a Mason. So those kinds of things, what makes Masonry relevant to that man, that's something that we have to keep a better idea of. I've seen a lot of guys come to the lodge, become Masons, tell us why they were interested, and then we try to give them a job that has nothing to do with that, and you never see them again.
Well, and I'll be honest, the reason I started into Masonry was not the reason I was there when I was raised. I mean,
was it National Treasure?
Oh, no, Gabe. No, we're not National Treasure brothers. It's not. No. For me, it was a part of my family history. I had no idea what it meant.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, I had so many family members that have been Masons, and I had no connection. And most of them were generations that I should have been able to get to know, but was not able to. Died young, heart attacks, high cholesterol, whatever it was. They died young, and I didn't get to know them. So to me, it was a way to kind of connect with that part of my family history.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently, Rhit and I both get to share the pleasure of going to lodge with our dad. It got brought my dad back into the craft. He hadn't been active in 15, 20 years. So
wow, that's kind of cool. I like that because he gets to share your journey, and so that's one of the best reasons to get involved again.
Oh yeah. I guess the reason I stayed is, I was able to make some friends that I could understand. So many of the guys we would hang out with were, boyfriends of Carly's friends. And I just didn't really get along with those dudes all that well. So, I had to force it. And now I can go to a place where I don't have to force it. It's just there. And so it's good stuff.
No, and I think the younger generation, while being inspired to join by George Washington or the Duke or whoever it may have been, may have really worked in a former generation, which it obviously did. It's not working in ours. And that's not good or bad. Guys are just joining for a different reason. While I think it's cool all day long that Ben Franklin was a Mason, I didn't join for that. I didn't know that he was beforehand. Most typically won't, know that kind of stuff. They're there for something else. And it, I'd say almost better part of half is because of grandpa or something like that, but ultimately they're there to do something for themselves and not brag they're a fraternity with George Washington. And it's like just different times.
Sell ever. It's a really bad sell.
I was going to say, since we're kind of talking about, celebrities of the Masonic nature, Robert, who do you recommend for brothers to look into when they're doing research? Like, let's say they want to pick some historical Masonic figure and they want just to dip their toes into the research world. Any particularly interesting individuals that you recommend to look into?
Are you asking about guys who are new Master Masons?
Yeah, maybe guys that are like new Master Masons and wanting to maybe write a paper, or they just want to read about somebody interesting.
And that goes back to now I used to take a different route with. I used to tell them until I found those cards from our old secretary. Our old secretary, William Quaby, was secretary for 60 years. So I kind of figured he was doing something right. And it's those cards. Now what I do, when the guys ask me that, Mason, I look at that card, I already have it remembered, and I think about what he was interested in, and then I figure out something that kind of fits with that. And as somebody on here was saying earlier, was talking about how the Masonic literature that's out there is endless. Well, you can use any of those books to link to whatever that individual is interested in. So I try to go there. As far as go-tos, if it's someone in Waco, one of my lodge members, I'll immediately give them a book on our lodge history and the link to our website to look at the history there. We've got over 200 biographies up on the website, so that there's a personal local connection that they're developing. But bigger, I am a fan of Albert Pike. It's probably cliche to say, but
he is a good one.
I love Morals and Dogma. It was the first real Masonic book I read, and it was right up my alley for what I was studying at Baylor at the time. So I really like that. But I also understand that's not something most people enjoy. So Born in Blood, if you have read that one, now it draws some historical connections that one could, but it's an interesting at the very least. So that's fun for a lot of folks. I don't know. That's a good question. I need to think more on that.
Robert, so on our second podcast, you had sent us a listener question regarding probably the coolest story that is not a movie we had ever heard. And I want to hear you tell it.
Josephus Steiner. He was a member of Waco Lodge, and he was in the Army. He was stationed in Fort Graham, which is where Lake Whitney is today, which is about halfway between Waco and Fort Worth. His commanding officer was a man named Ripley Arnold. Ripley Arnold's famously remembered for having been the founder of Fort Worth. And Ripley Arnold, I've seen several sources show, was known to be abrasive as a leader. That's the best way I can put it.
That's PC.
Yeah, and so to be clear, Ripley Arnold was Josephus Steiner's commanding officer. Both men were Masons. I know that much for sure. I don't know which lodge Ripley Arnold was a member of. I haven't found that, but I do know Joseph Steiner was a member of Waco Lodge, and Ripley Arnold was the founder of Fort Worth. So they had a disagreement. I know it was not their fault, but this time it got pretty ugly, and there was a shootout. Now we're talking mid-1800s Texas, so shootouts were generally the way you solved disagreements at the time. And it ended with Ripley Arnold dying of gunshot wounds. It's never been really clearly stated who shot first, but the end result there is pretty big. Josephus Steiner killed his commanding officer. That is a no-no. You don't have to have been in the military to know that. And in Austin, where the, commanding officers were, they drew up court-martial. We're going to bring Josephus Steiner down to Austin from the Hillsborough area and bring him to military trial. So they sent an escort. The escort got up there, found him, and was bringing him to Austin. And while he was passing through Waco, a band of men who were never officially identified, but in our minutes, there are a couple of notes that speak of this band of men in a very friendly manner, who intercepted the arresting party and stopped Brother Josephus Steiner from being court-martialed in Austin, so much so that the arresting officer said, "To heck with this," and went back to Austin without Steiner. This happened about, if I remember right, 4 or 5 times. The guys and the commanding officers in Austin were very angry, said, "Go get him," sent the arresting officer back, and over again, what I ultimately believe was a group of Masons from Waco 92 repeatedly stopped the arrest from happening. And that's what I sent to you. Ultimately, a member of Waco 92 murdered the founder of Fort Worth. The Army got tired of trying to court-martial him, so they acquitted him and just said, "To heck with it." And the guy essentially got away with murder.
The magic of Texas.
Oh man,
yeah.
Wasn't he a doctor?
The early
He
Wild
was.
West was really
That's right.
something.
He was a doctor, Dr. Josephus Steiner.
I really could see that being a movie. That would be a lot of fun. They'd have to add a shootout at the end. Probably some sort of love story in there. For the lady folks. And I think it could be a hit, man. You need to write the script.
Now, there have been a lot of shootouts related to Waco Lodge.
Oh,
I think
wow.
that can be said about almost any older lodge, though.
Yeah,
you all
that's
have
true.
to have a history of shootouts. It got a little hairy there. It's a lot calmer now for those folks who aren't in Texas. We don't go around shooting at each other anymore, for the most part.
It's good to put that out there.
Here's the part, insert contentious comment about resolution number 1. Anyway. That's going to make everybody mad, so I'm not going to do that.
I tell you, that's one of the first things I get asked when I travel to other states. Oh, y'all walk around with giant guns on your hips? Like, most of us conceal. Is my normal answer.
Yeah, well,
and then I get an odd look, and they do the up and down look. It's pretty funny.
And I had to explain to somebody that up until last year or like 2 years ago, it was illegal to walk around with a gun visibly on your hip. So the perception of Texas is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Good old
those were
Texas.
some dark times, Gabe. You're very correct. I think that's what you're getting at there.
So, Robert, when you're looking up stories like the shootout, and delving deep into all of this, what are your preferred resources? Like if I wanted to research a paper or something like that, what do you recommend in terms of where best to look? Where do I get started?
Well, one thing I use is a collection of books and newspapers that is unhealthy, but I've got more books and newspapers than anyone should have. So I go through a lot of and regionally published books. However, anybody can use several of the resources I use. Number one, the first time a name pops up that I want to look into, I search for him on findagrave.com. It's a cemetery lookup database. It will usually bring up a picture of somebody's gravesite. It'll give you their birth date, death date, and sometimes it'll even have their original obituary printed there. So I start there. Then I hit the books and stuff I have to see if I can find anything that might have been mentioning the person's name, as well as newspapers.com. It's an even better newspaper collection than I have. You can search newspapers going back to, I think, the 1600s on newspapers.com all over the country. And that's a very useful one for researching early members. Google, if you know how to use your search parameters, Google can be very useful. If you put quotes around an exact first, middle, and last name, it will search for that exact first, middle, and last name in that order in everything, in every book that they have on Google and every website on the internet. I use that. I use everything I can find, really. Baylor and some library databases that are on useful. And I use things that you wouldn't expect. In New York City, there's a library there that has a menu collection, like restaurant menus, historic restaurant menus. And there I found on top of a couple of old Waco menus from about 1900, 3 pictures of our Masonic Lodge that we didn't have copies of. And that's on a restaurant menu in New York City, halfway across the country. So you never know where you're going to find stuff. They do have a subscription option. A great amount of their newspapers are freely accessible. I think it's up to like 1905 or something like that. A huge portion of them are free to search, but the subscription option opens up everything they have on there, and it's useful. Another one I didn't mention.
If you're just trying to wet your lips, then that's a good start then.
Absolutely it is. Another one I didn't mention is Root Web. I've been using that one since I was 11 years old doing history research. Root Web? This is what I was doing, guys, when y'all were making friends and being social and doing things growing up. I was in books and on computers doing history research because that's just how sad my life is. But all the way back then, I started using rootsweb.com, and it's a genealogy project that was actually was eventually absorbed by Ancestry, but it's free. It's not ancestry.com. It's a free database where you can look up names of people and birth dates and death dates, and a lot of times descendants of those people will be posting on there and sharing stories that they have found about them. And one big way I've been able to do research on the history of my lodge is by tracking down the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of those early members and getting pictures and stories and things like that from those people.
Oh, that is really cool. Do you travel much then when you're doing your research?
I travel a lot anyway, and when traveling to, if I'm going to, say, Chicago, I will search my notes and everything that I have for Waco Lodge history for Chicago to see if there's any kind of follow-up research I need to do while I'm there. I do travel for a lot of.
Okay. Do you travel then for your work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sometimes
what
for
is
fun.
Your regular vocation?
I'm kind of, what would you call it? I've ADD or ADHD as a career. I get really passionate about something and will stay passionate about it for a while, and then I'll need to switch gears. So I've started my own businesses through the years, everything from appliance sales to fitness gyms and stuff like that. I'm a personal trainer that pays some of my bills. I own a metal construction company. We've done construction all over the country, from Hawaii to New York, and mostly commercial projects, roofing systems on schools and banks and things like that. I've done several projects right up by y'all's lodge. And the fun thing about those is if I go with one of my crews, I might work all day on a roof, but then I can go hit a lodge. So the metal company is very, very useful. I've also started working for the state of Texas. I do historical research and work at some of their state parks, and especially down here by I got a house down here in Falls, and whenever I'm down here, I head up to Longhorn Cavern, and I do guided tours and research there, helping improve that. And I got to tell you, there's actually a really neat Masonic story that I've dug up at Longhorn Cavern. And it happened in 1840 when Texas was still its own country. A wealthy teenage girl was kidnapped in San Antonio by Comanche Native Americans. They brought her north as far as Burnett, and they were hiding with her in Longhorn Cavern. If you guys ever go to Longhorn, you'll be able to see all the places where this story happened. 3 Texas Rangers, William McGill, Noah Smithwick, and Logan Vanderveer, went to rescue the girl. And they lowered a rope ladder down through part of the cave, and they eventually ended up rescuing the girl. And it's this incredible story. But the neat thing about it is that those rangers knew each other because they were all members of the same Masonic Lodge, Valley Lodge in Burnett. So it's three brothers going to rescue this girl from the natives. And it's just this really, really cool story. So we've tied that in up there at the cavern. That's something I do now for a side job. I also substitute teach at Waco ISD and coach Texas history mostly. And let's see, every once in a while I'm lucky enough to be right on somebody's family history or some other kind of thing. That about covers. I'm a personal trainer. I own, teach, and I do stuff for the state park system.
So everything but a plumber.
That's right. Don't let me anywhere near your plumber.
You know what? I keep noticing this.
You could have just said that.
A lot of brothers tend to be involved in things that they are their own bosses. That's kind of a repeated pattern I've noticed with a lot of guys.
Yeah, I've actually noticed that too. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, even guys who work for a company are in spots where they make their own schedule and stuff like that. A lot of guys travel too. I meet a lot of Masons traveling around, and most of those guys are traveling around.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, definitely helps.
We're supposed to be traveling men. That's right.
It works. It makes sense.
I think too many brothers travel and don't make a point to stop by the lodges where they're traveling. Even if you just go see a building, if you're traveling, I don't know why you wouldn't take 20 minutes to swing by a Masonic temple when you have a little time.
Yeah, and for anybody that does want to see pictures of buildings, you can find me on Instagram. I'm at Texan Mason on Instagram, and my Instagram is basically only lodge buildings at this point. So for anybody that wants to go check that out, that's what I've got.
Who's that talking? I can't see who it is.
It's
Gabe.
Me. Gabe.
Oh, Gabe. Okay, I thought the voice sounded familiar. Oh, that's cool. I'll definitely be checking that out.
Yeah. The jumping gears, when we were talking last Friday, you mentioned that Waco 92 recently digitized its lodge minutes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project? I was fascinated when you were telling me about it, and you made it seem like it was a huge project.
Well, the whole thing is a huge project. Digitizing them actually hasn't been too bad. I use a quick scan quick scan device. It's a little painstaking just because it takes so long. We have our minutes all the way back to 1861. Our first 9 years burned in a fire, but we do have back to 1861 at least. And of course, gotta go page by page, but what I'm doing to preserve them is really the project. And I learned this at the county records building. They're doing the same thing with their records, which incidentally are mostly written by the same people, and in very similar books. But actually going through the process of, and this is going to sound terrible at first, but you take a page in those very, very old minute books, and you actually cut the page all the way down at the binding, and you cut it out of the book, which, again, even to me as a historian, when I was first being told to do this, my eyes were popping out of my head. But what you're doing, you're removing that page from the book. You're not damaging any of the writing or the page itself. Then you spray it with a deacidification spray. It's guaranteed to extend the life of the ink on the paper at least 100 years. They guarantee it. You're adding a century of being able to read your minutes. Then you take that page and preserve it in a plastic sheet, a non-static plastic sleeve, and then you just put them right into a new book. So it works just like it originally was. You're able to flip through the pages just like a book. The difference is you're not touching them, and they're not being exposed to anything in the air anymore. So that's what I'm doing to preserve those minutes. And I think it's worth doing. And I got to tell you, there's no telling what you're going to see in those minutes. There's all kinds of stuff they used to put in there.
What's the cost on something like that? If you're doing it yourself, just raw material cost.
Major cost you're looking at is time. The financial cost is actually pretty minimal. I think, considering what you're doing, preserving the actual history of your lodge, a good deacidification, you're going to be able to get for around $50, and that thing might last you through 50 years of minutes. So you can get a big old bottle for $50. And then the books, the sleeves and things like that, you're looking at spending another $50 to $100. I think really minutes, if you're talking about preserving 150, 200 years worth of minutes, you could probably get it all done in under $200.
Oh, that's not at all what I was thinking.
Right. It's not that expensive. It's just time. It's a lot of time.
Okay. So on the digitizing, I had a question on the digitizing. Have you found a way to create these digital documents into something searchable? Is there anything out there that can read that handwriting or start deciphering it for you? That would be a dream to have.
There are things out there. Those things actually tend to be expensive. The softwares that can do that, you're going to pay a pretty penny for. I haven't done that yet. What I'm actually doing right now is through some of the other research and things I'm doing with museums. I work with several museums around Texas. I'm trying to figure out a way to make it cost effective. They have those kinds of programs with documents. If you could get these things scanned and hit Control F and find anything you want in 100 years worth of minutes, that's a game changer. So you're right on the right track. That's the next thing that's my next hurdle.
So could it even get cost effective? Okay, now I'm going way out, but if try to get it as an investment in the Grand Lodge and then work it through the Grand Lodge level.
Yeah. I think that's probably something that ought to be looked at. Kansas is doing that right now. In my conversations with Alex Powers of Historical Light, the Kansas Grand Lodge has opened itself up to lodges sending their minutes to the Grand Lodge, and they are personally going through this time-consuming process of preserving them for the lodges. So
cool.
Yeah, that is definitely a conversation to be had.
Man, can you imagine the ability to be able to log into some central database and anytime you needed to know anything, just be like, well, I know that this happened in this lodge over, on the other side of town, but I'm not really sure. Let me see if I can request, reading access to this database, and then send an email, whatever, get reading access to that one, and then boom.
Being able to do that with the minutes of a lodge would be amazing. Now, I have done something similar with our lodge already. If you go to our website at wacomasonic.org, there is a search bar there on our website. If you were to type in anything like murder, if you wanted to bring up that Josephus Steiner story from earlier, or bridge to see how the Waco Masons originally owned the suspension bridge, TCU to find out any of these kinds of things, you just type that in the search bar and it's going to bring you up every single biography that I've mentioned that in. And as I said earlier, I've gotten about 200 biographies up to the website now. I'm not even halfway through the ones I have written, but 200's enough that it's become, I was told by another museum here in Waco, unrelated to Masonry, and the librarian here at the Waco Library, that they're using it as the go-to database for Waco history now. And that's something that's doable if you can just find some lodge members to take the time to do it.
I gotta say, your website is very impressive.
It's really nice.
I've burned some hours on your website. So anyone out there, it's really worth a look. Give them the URL again real quick, Robert.
wacomasonic.org. And if you want to look at something specific like the history, you can hit /history at the end of that URL, past masters /past-masters. But like I said, you can just scroll down on the main page there to the search bar and find anything you want.
Yeah, it's really user friendly.
That's the goal.
So
I had to convince the lodge members who are 70 years old to do this. So one catch in convincing them was making it to where it'd be easy to use for them too. And that's part of the motivation is I want anybody, I don't care what your age is or what your capability is on the internet, to be able to go to the lodge website and find what you want.
So between the website and, digitizing the minutes, I actually had a question specific to the meetings. What kind of digital tech do you guys use for meetings, if any? I mean, I'm sure that you got a laptop to type on or whatever. I recently had somebody suggest that I should use an iPad for signing in guests. Do y'all have anything like that? Maybe a stenography machine. I don't know if we're gonna reach really far.
I like books, being a book nerd. So no, I haven't actually pushed for that. But however, my first stated meeting as secretary will be this Thursday, and I do have it set up now. I've got a minutes template that I'll be using, and I'm going to type the minutes up right there, and they'll be immediately printable and editable for the editing of the minutes. I'm trying to think. It was, y'all mentioned his name earlier, Roberto Sanchez. He sent me a template for minutes that he made, and I've modified it to fit for our lodge. So shout out to him. Thanks, Roberto. I think that's one way that we're going to be digitizing the lodge now. But I haven't thought about that. That's a brilliant idea. I used a sign-in book for our open houses over the last year, which were very well attended. We had over 50 guests both times. And that sign-in book, I can't tell you how, if you want to make your open house a success, find out who came and put a label on there for how they heard about it. And that's been really valuable for us, finding out why the people who are visiting, and then focusing on those things to grow them.
I love that idea, because we have something similar in real estate to open house. We have a sign-in, ask them certain questions and gets in contact information. So after the open house, I can email everybody that showed up and tell them, hey, thanks for coming. One click. And,
that's exactly what I did.
We talked about it. Yeah, I mean, because we talked about doing that. We got sign-in cards, getting emails and thanking them. But it would make it a lot easier if we had an app for that.
Have them put it in, and all we got to do is one click, and we're moving forward. That is actually a pretty good idea. An iPad would be cool too, because most people are familiar enough with an iPad to type into it, and then you don't have to worry about reading handwriting.
I was going to say maybe like a laptop with a touch screen. So then that way, they use the touch screen to tap everything in, and if they're a new guest and they haven't input their name into the system yet, and they can't tap their name because they're not in, they can type it in using just the laptop keyboard. That'd be kind of cool. Speaking of the minutes template, something I was actually just thought of this. What's your take on the idea of maybe printing the minutes before the meeting, handing them out to everybody, and then saying, if everybody's read the minutes on their own, we'll mark them as read. Something, instead of reading them out loud for the purposes of efficiency.
I love that idea. It's something now that I'm secretary, going to explore to see just how much of that we can do. Of course, the Grand Lodge is, a mile away from us, so we try to stick pretty close to the books. We're not going to try to sneak anything past them, because those. But I really, really like that idea. I think it is important to keep the membership up to date on what we've been doing. But I think that reading the minutes every meeting comes from an era when that was the only way to efficiently update the guys on what we've been doing. So we now live in a time where you can send an email and let everybody know what happened in the meeting. You can send a text. I've got an app now. I made an app for our lodge where You can do all kinds of things in there, and you can just right there, boom, this is what happened, this is how it went, here's your update. That would cut a lot of time out of those business meetings. The funny thing, the reason we're actually thinking about doing exactly what you said there, printing them out so we can get everybody to read them and then just hit any highlights that have to be gone over. Our goal, according to our new worshipful master, Keith Sanders, he said one of his goals is to make the stated meeting short enough that Stan never leaves. Stan is an 85-ish year old retired postman who's a member of our lodge, and usually he gets up halfway through a stated meeting and leaves because he's getting tired and wants to go home. So on our agenda for the year is to make meetings short enough that Stan never leaves. One way to do that would be shortening those minutes readings.
And I like that, though, because that's, Stan sounds like a guy who has put in the time. He spent a lot of, he's spent the years being a Mason. And with age comes sometimes comes the inability to participate as fully as you would like. Mm-hmm. So making the meetings more accessible to guys like Stan is a wonderful idea. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that reminds me.
Go ahead, Rhit. I'm sorry.
No, you're all right, Grant. I was going to say it reminded me. Cully came up and ate dinner with us, but didn't have time to stay for the meeting. And I wish we would encourage more of that. To bring your family up, have a quick meal on the lodge. We'll clean up. You come eat. You go home. You don't even have to go to the meeting, because that's perfectly fine.
Yep.
Not everybody's got time, but hey, you got 20 minutes to drive up here and home. You get you a free meal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd rather have somebody come and enjoy the meal and leave early, or show up halfway through stated and join us late, and even if it's just for 20 minutes, just a little bit of fraternity in some manner,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's really cool.
A couple stated meetings back, our babysitter fell through. I still came up for dinner. I brought my daughter. She had a great time. And I didn't go to the meeting, but I got to go see everybody, and it was really nice. And she was super worn out when we got home. She went right to bed. It was awesome.
It was great to catch up with Cully, and we hadn't seen him in so long, but we interact on Facebook, so it's always good to shake his hand and hug his neck again. Even though he doesn't have time for the meeting, nobody should feel that pressure. If you can't make one or the other, come on up for whatever you can make it for.
Yeah, because, we can text each other and call each other and Facebook message each other or whatever, but it's not quite the same as just sitting across the dude from the table face to face and just sharing and breaking bread. That's the important part.
And I think that's one big thing for the younger generation. We got to start selling more about Masonry. Mm-hmm. Is like face-to-face interaction with other men. Where you can,
That's a really good point. One thing that drives me elsewhere when I'm traveling is older Masons are really quick to say that the fraternity's dying because the younger generation doesn't care about face-to-face interaction, that they just want to be on Facebook. And I can't tell you how untrue that is. Our generation yearns for face-to-face interaction and real connection because we are now surrounded by so much fake interaction. So we got to beat that misconception. There's too many guys out there who think that young men don't want to be Masons because they don't want to have to be face-to-face.
And it's actually really interesting. I like that you call it fake interaction because that's really kind of what it is. I was reading a paper that talks about the increase in incidents, or I guess the correlation with rates of depression and amount of social media usage, because when you use social media, it creates the illusion that you are still connecting with other people, and to a certain extent you are, but it's not the same, and doesn't fulfill the same needs that you have for interaction. So you begin to feel hollow, and there's, maybe your relationships don't mean as much and that kind of thing, and you become depressed. Like, you can get depression from it because you're not having true interactions. And so something that we need to it's not that, young guys, maybe it's not that young guys don't want face-to-face. Maybe it's that younger guys don't understand that face-to-face is what they're looking for, because they're looking for something, but they don't know what it is.
Or you don't know that you're missing it, and you don't know where to go get it. When I moved back to Fort Worth, I didn't know where to go to make friends. I went to work. I don't I make friends at work, but I'm typically not going out with work friends. I didn't know where to go to make friends. You're going to go to a bar. You're going to go to the gym. When I'm at the gym, man, I'm working out. I'm not making friends. Right?
Yeah, I'm the
I want
same
people
way.
to leave me alone at the gym.
Yeah, just get out of my way. Disturbed is on, and I'm a freight train.
Dude, I literally have a collection of gym shirts telling people to leave me alone.
That's pretty cool. But it's hard to know where to go to make friends, and he started working at the job at our job, and I noticed he was we won't mention a blue book, but I noticed it, and and we started talking about it, and he had asked me a couple questions when we first met that I now recognize he was trying to see if I was a Mason, and he invited me up, and the first meeting, it was like, holy cow, there are a bunch of guys in this room that know how to think.
Yes.
You're kidding me? And they're my age? Okay, yeah, I think this is gonna work. So yeah, it sometimes you just don't know where to go, and I think a lot of our generation is at that point. You used to go to church to make friends. A lot of guys don't go to
I've
church.
thought a lot about this. Yeah, because I've heard that argument that, and I even fell for it for a few years, that the younger generation doesn't join because they're on Facebook. They watch Netflix. They don't want the face-to-face interaction. And if you really think about that, that's that generation pointing the finger at another generation. And there's the old adage, if you're pointing one finger, there's three pointing right back at you. And it all boils down to that these guys are wanting meaningful interactions. And it kind of goes back to that conversation we had earlier about sitting down at the dinner table with a bunch of guys that are way older, and there's that generational gap, because what they did for fun to, how they watch sports, how they interact, it's different today. So when I'm trying to tell them about a funny meme, they had, much less haven't seen it, they don't even know what a meme is, so it's hard to make those meaningful interactions. And Grant's a great example. Yeah, meaningful. I would dare say, Grant, you came to Masonry and it stuck for you because of the friendships you made. And if you rewind 15 years, I don't see that happening.
Oh,
because
it would have been harder. That's for sure.
Yeah. Because Brother Sam's perfect mentor, greatest man I ever knew, but I didn't call him on a Friday night to talk to him about the ball game. Where he inspired me to be a great Mason. But until I started developing friendships in Lodge, that it really didn't turn the corner to where the foxhole mentality set in, as I like to call it, to where if those bros are going to be at Lodge, I'm going to be at Lodge come hell or high water type of thing.
That is such a good point. I love what you just said. I'll be listening to that over and over again after we're done. We say we make good men better men. We don't say we make good men Masons. And I think there's a reason. We're not supposed to just be doing things Masonically together and that's it. You're supposed to be calling each other to talk about the ball game on a Friday night. That's such a good point.
Well, and Greg and my son hang out together, and they get good interaction with good children, and then I get to hang out with a good man, and Masonry afforded me that, to where if that wasn't there, Masonry wouldn't be as meaningful. And I'm not discounting old guys. I'm just saying they don't have kids anymore. They don't have the commonality that you have with someone in your same age group going through the same kind of things and grew up on the Dukes of Hazzard or whatever you watched,
Wow, you really dated yourself there.
Right.
Just at Lodge, we just had a conversation about Gilligan's Island that I won't share on the internet. So.
And Rhit, I think that's a great point. And the other thing is, these days, 5 years ago, if I had something, going on that I needed a second set of hands with, I would have either called my brother and, waited 2 weeks for him to show up to help. Nowadays, I start scrolling through my phone. I'm like, okay, this brother, I didn't pick up. All right, next brother. All right, and go down, and it's like, hey, man, I need help with a guy thing, right? Like I'm installing something, I need a second set of hands, anything like that, and those little interactions build bonds because then it's, well, if you're coming over, go ahead and bring your wife and kids, or if you're coming over, why don't you bring your girlfriend for dinner? Gabe, nudge, nudge, hint, hint.
It's gonna happen.
Actually,
just navigating the night
that.
Shift issues.
I mandated that when I went in as worshipful master at my very first stated meeting. I told every member at the meeting that their task for the next month was to either visit another brother's church or go have dinner with another brother's family at his house, to go do something unmasonic, or not unmasonic, but
all right, we're gonna go betray them secrets.
Step outside of the Masonic bubble and go do something with that person that's not directly related to Masonry, and meet their family, get to know them a little bit more. And I think that really helped quite a few of us in our lodge develop more meaningful friendships.
Yep.
Well, and at the end of the day, it's about friendship and brotherly love. So I don't think you get to brotherly love without establishing a friendship. And the guys who we're calling the older generation, they formed those bonds with the other guys of their generation. And back then they didn't have social media to reach out. So do you guys remember when you were kids, surprise visitors being like an exciting thing? Like, hey, a guy came that wasn't able to get to a phone and we know him and everyone's excited. And now, like, someone knocks at the door you're not expecting, you're like, all right, honey, you go to the back bedroom, I'm going to get the German Shepherd. We're going to see who's here.
Like, I have had that. Like, that is weirdly enough like my go-to instinct. Like, doorbell rings in the evening and I'm not expecting that, like I'm grabbing my AR-15, like end of story.
That must be a Fort Worth thing. We're still a small enough town to welcome visitors.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think we're just running high on paranoia.
I'm kidding. If we're being honest here, Waco's famous for not being very welcome to people knocking on the door, right? the Branch Davidians and all that.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a rabbit hole we could get into, but let's not do that because I don't want the ATF to shoot my dog. So, switching gears from, you're really active on social media, right? And I wanted to ask, how can we better manage our social presence as individual Masons, as lodges, and as a fraternity in general? Like I know that we're doing like a subject whiplash here, but we were going off into the rabbit hole.
Yeah, but no, I could do a whole show just on this. I want to tell you first off that one thing that drives me absolutely insane about Masons on social media, and I hope none of you guys are guilty of this, or I'm going to feel really bad, but there are guys out there who on Facebook use a square and compass as their profile picture.
Yes.
Now
yes.
Now that isn't in itself a horrible thing, but it's kind of on the fence for me. But then when those guys spend most of their time on social media sharing or writing about their very intense political beliefs or religious beliefs, or they put things out there on social media that are very alienating to large groups of other people, but they're doing it with a square and compass as their profile picture.
They're being the crazy Mason guy.
They are validating conspiracy theories. There's one guy who really gets me. I'm not obviously going to say his name, but there's a guy out there in the world somewhere who uses a square and compass as his profile picture, and he posts lots of things about why Muslims are the worst thing that have ever happened. And that drives me insane. I can't stand it. There's too much of that. I think if you're going to be on social media as a Mason, it's good, but you need to be very careful about keeping your personal social media personality separate from Masonry. Don't publish your views with a square and compass attached to it. I think that's dangerous.
And I had this discussion with somebody that I know in person who often posts stuff online on Facebook, and now his profile picture isn't a square and compass, although it let's just say at times has been York Rite related, and very visibly so. So you get, you've got a big old Templar or whatever, right? And so you have two things going on there. That's Masonic in nature, and it's also Christian in nature. And both Masonry and Christianity are, two different, very, very different types, but they are both types of higher callings. One is secular and one is religious, but he's always posting super inflammatory stuff.
Yes.
And I'm not going to go into it because, I'm not going to share my personal politics or his personal politics on the podcast, but it's inflammatory. And I had to have this conversation with him, like, listen, man, people know that you're a Mason. They look at your Facebook photo and they see this. And I don't care if you have those views. If you want to have those views, you should have those views because that's your right. But we need to conduct ourselves and communicate in ways that are beyond reproach, right?
Yep.
We have to be above criticism, because if we're going to talk, if we're going to go back to that idea of being more visible in our community, then we cannot afford to be aggravating other people.
Exactly.
So
and
I'm just going to step off my soapbox, but yeah.
I agree with you. We're talking about getting people interested in Masonry, whether it's to become if you put something inflammatory out there, every single person who thinks the other way about that subject is now never going to have anything to do with it. And that's the real consequence of doing it.
Well, and guys, it's one of the first things we're charged with as Masons to, walk and act with respect, right? And you really, I think social media can kind of degrade conversations to you are either side A or side B. And most Masons I know think a lot deeper than that.
Yeah.
And we need to reflect it in the way even some guys that you see post some really, really, really dumb stuff. some stuff that you're just like, man, that is way far out.
Yeah.
Talk to that guy, and he has a deep understanding of every side of the story, but he's jumping on the A or B side train. And, we got to get above that because, we don't want to be on the B side when it's decided that's the wrong place to be.
I agree. Now, we talked about what not to do on social.
What should we do on social media?
I think something that I've noticed a lot of lodges aren't doing with their social media pages is interacting with other organizations in their community. One thing that other nonprofits are doing very well these days is being active in social media and interacting with the people around them. And not only could we learn by doing so, engage those other nonprofits, and you're immediately going to be interacting with all of the people they've already developed followings with. So I think we should do a better job with our lodges of connecting to not just Masonic entities, but also other entities in our community that are not Masonic themselves.
That's interesting because you see a lot of lodges interacting with each other, and their Facebook pages are connected, and they talk for degree nights and try to get big turnouts and stuff like that. The idea of a Masonic lodge interacting with the first one I can think of is Carter Blood Center and our other big blood donor. But if we do a blood drive, if you do a blood drive, why shouldn't your post about the blood drive for your public lodge page link you over to the other people?
Exactly.
To that organization, because then both organizations see it. That's a simple change to make on most social media platforms too. That's an easy one to do.
For our lodge page, we have just as many people who are just interested in Waco history. And that has created some crossover between those things. People who were just interested in Waco history at one point have now become Masons, and people who are now interested in learning about Waco history have. But also organizationally, the open house in October, we had tables set up and guests from the Dr. Pepper Museum, the Texas Ranger Museum, and the Historic Waco Foundation, which runs a lot of historic homes in Waco. Well, all three of those guys have very active social media pages. And so when we had our open house with those coming, it was announced on those social media pages. And a good several dozen of the folks that came were because they saw those social media pages interacting with ours about the event. So it can pay dividends to interact with things outside of Masonry through social.
So I wanted to ask you, if we time travel to the future and your great grandson is writing a history book about Masonry in that long ago era of the 2010s and 2020s, what is he going to be writing about? I guess, what is he going to be writing about you? What is he going to be writing about Waco 92? And what's he going to be writing about Texas Masonry in those long ago years of the 2020s? Or 2010s, too. I guess we still got a few of those.
If you look back historically, Masonic membership has fluctuated. It'll gradually decline over time, and then something will happen that will cause a huge surplus in membership. Usually a war ends and everybody comes home, or the economy gets really good, or something like that happens. What I really, really hope that people look back and write about the era in Masonry that we're living in is that we did everything we could to maximize the potential for when that next trend shifts and we have a surplus in Masonry. We have to do all the right things we possibly can right now, because admittedly we are massive decline. That's a half century old. We could get into all the reasons for that, but membership's gone down, and history that a time is coming at some point in the future when membership's going to skyrocket. The best we can do is have ourselves in a position to benefit from that when it does come, and do it in a way that's positive, that all of those new members who come inherit something that they can be proud of the same way that we have. So that's what you would hope they write about. What they will be writing about, I think one major thing they have to be writing about this era is the breakdown of the racial divide. That's going to be something I think historically will be huge. The same way we talk about the civil rights movement within society, a similar thing has happened in Masonry 10 to 15 years.
What's your question, Rhit?
So it was the whole reason I had Robert on the podcast is I wanted to know if we're going to have another party at Grand Lodge this year.
Yeah, it's looking like we are. Brandon Jenkins has said he's willing to come do it again. And I'll look into having some other artists as well. But yep, the plans right now are to do that again, do it at the same place, and have a very similar setup with some additions. We'll have some more, if you'll remember the big giant projector that was up on the screen there outside. We'll have some more interesting Masonic things being shown there throughout the night.
Cool.
And looking at maybe presenting some kind of award in the middle of a concert, stopping it and presenting an award on stage. But I don't know. We've got some different ideas coming on. Regardless, Gabe here thinks we should show National Treasure on the projection screen the whole time. I think that's a very fun idea. I will tell you that we got a lot of feedback from Wacoans because you remember late that night, the Waco Masonic logo was put up on that screen, and it was massive. And so there were lots of people who drove through downtown that night and saw that projected up there. And there were all kinds of ideas along the National Treasure line of what was going down. But
It was impressive though, like to see how big that logo was. That was really cool.
It was a brand new logo. John Michael Gillespie had just finished designing it for us, so that was kind of the major use of it, and I'm glad we were able to. But the whole idea of that event was you guys come from all over the state for the Grand Lodge meeting. It's a business meeting, but you should have some fun while you're here. So my hope is that is the start of what will be an annual event, that it will grow, that eventually we'll be able to raise money off of it to give a scholarship at the event every year or something along those lines. And the main thing is being hospitable to all you guys who drive all the way to Waco and wonder why you do it.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. If you want to make it memorable, that's how you do it. Because Grand Lodges will meld together with the business meetings, but the fellowship afterwards lasts forever.
And there was a group.
Oh, go for it.
There was a group from Laredo Lodge. That's a shout out to Ruben and those other. It was very clear that all or most of that group came just for the concert and weren't coming to Grand Lodge. Now, to knock Grand Lodge, but my point is we might be able to get a much better turnout to Grand Lodge if we had something like that celebration going every year.
And I know a couple of guys that says, man, I wish I'd known, and I know because you'd been talking about it, but there were still a couple of people that are like, oh man, if I'd known that it was going to be that good, I would have gone. And because they knew that it was going on because it was published, but they just like, it's going to be a little get together. And then next day, everybody's just on fire talking about it. I'm just going, yeah, you guys missed something awesome. One of the coolest statements that I'd heard that night, or that the next day, was that we got more masonry done that night than at all of Grand Lodge, which Grand Lodge.
Wow, that's a really cool thing to hear.
Yeah, it was a good time. Absolutely, and everybody should plan. Even if you don't party with us, you should find somebody to fellowship with at Grand Lodge because it's a great opportunity to trade ideas, what's worked, what hasn't, and just get to know your bros.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So it's good to hear. Good to hear. I'm ready to party.
Yep, we'll be doing it. I also recall that it was Fort Worth Lodge members who made sure that I was well hydrated with buckets of hydration that night. I was very grateful for that. I don't think most folks know, but I have a giant blue Sprinter van that I've converted into an RV, and I travel all over the place in it. But the fun thing about it is I had it plugged into the back of that restaurant that night, and So at the end of the night, instead of having to drive anywhere, I actually had a bed right there on site. So all of those buckets of hydration made having a bed on site very useful.
Yeah, I was a designated driver that night, and so one of my memories, I only got like 2 hours of sleep that night because I remember, like being in the Whataburger drive-through at like 3 a.m. because a certain individual, we were telling, all right, brother, we're gonna put you to bed. No, Whataburger, and I'm like, okay, we're going to go get you Whataburger. Anybody else? And so I took a couple guys to go get Whataburger with me. And we're there 3 a.m. and almost, not every car, but almost every car in that drive-thru had a little square and compass somewhere on the back or in a window or something. It's just a bunch of guys getting real hungry.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah. And then we had that breakfast at 6 a.m. So, oh, Lord.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the good thing here is if Waco 92 is hosting you late night event, we're also the ones doing the coffee shop in the basement of the Grand Lodge when you get there the next morning. So we're ready to give you the fuel you need to power through.
Robert, if you want to leave us with I know we've been kind of all over the place talking about social media and modern things, but primarily we have been talking about history in Texas. You want to leave us with some closing thoughts on the subject of tonight?
Sure. I believe we called it the Lone Star episode.
Yeah, I think Lone Star Masonry.
That's a good name for it. The Lone Star on the flag has a very relevant origin to our brotherhood. The men who decided to put a star on the Texas flag thought it was very appropriate because it reminded them of a certain 5 points of fellowship. So I think that's a really appropriate name for anything when it comes to Texas Masonic history.
And so for anybody that's missing context on that, think back to your master's degree.
That's right.
Or finish your proficiency and become a master.
There you go.
Bringing that carrot out there. Come on, man.
So tonight's fraternal quote is, "I believe that my role is to preserve and disseminate Masonic light and knowledge. One of the things I've tried to do is publish and or write books which I wish had existed when I was a younger Mason. It was well nigh impossible to find some of the things I've published when I was younger." And that quote is by our illustrious brother Arturo de Hoyos, 33rd degree Grand Cross of Honor, Grand Archivist, and Grand Historian of the Supreme Council, 33rd degree of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, United States of America. So,
wow. It's a good one.
Yeah, and so our brother de Hoyos knows what he's talking about.
Absolutely.
Arturo's incredible.
Yeah, he is a great guy. I know I have thoroughly enjoyed this podcast. I can't wait to re-listen to it. Robert, we're going to have to do this again. I mean, obviously.
Well, you just let me know, and now I know I don't have to dress up for it, so you just let me know whenever you want to do it.
Yeah. Robert,
awesome,
would you like to, plug any personal or lodge websites that you'd like our listeners to go visit?
Don't forget to check out wacomasonic.org and be sure to go by our Facebook page and like that Facebook page. I've just uploaded this week a handful of videos about some of our members, guys like Shapely Ross, Soul Ross's dad, and some others. But the really cool one that's up there now is a video of Ted Lyons, who I mentioned earlier in this episode, Hall of Fame baseball pitcher. He is teaching some islanders on the Marshall Islands how to play baseball in November 1944 while they were serving in World War II. So be sure to go check out that video. It's an absolute gem.
Very cool.
All right, fellas. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being on.
This is Rhit Moore signing off.
Grant Gates signing off.
Gabriel Jagush signing off.
Robert Marshall signing off.